Saw Gerrera.
He fashions himself as our leader, though no one elected him.
Civilians? Times change, targets change. Why don't you take a look at the insurgents you were sent to destroy?
Are you saying we should actually become a terrorist organization? That we should slaughter anyone between us and the Empire? Why not? Saw asked. That's how they'll spin it anyway, right, Jyn?
You target civilians! Kill those who surrender! Break every rule of engagement! If we degrade ourselves to the Empire's level, what will we become?
There she is! That's the leader the rebellion needs! Where is that fire, that passion, when your people need it most?
What's up, Meta Nerds? This complete life video will put every piece of media with Saw Gerrera in chronological order, from birth, through freedom fighter in the Clone Wars, to an ever-increasing brutality in the fight against the Empire. That labeled him one of the highest priority terrorists, and even burned his bridges with the allies in the Rebel Alliance. This will have everything released prior to the Andor show, so like with all these types of videos, there may eventually be new content, and when I cover that, it'll be linked down in the description. His story starts at grid coordinates 09, within the Japriel sector of the Inner Rim. Though near the core, Onderon was historically always seen as isolationist and violent. As Mandalore the Preserver once put it,
like us, the people of Onderon are warriors. Early in their history, they built ISIS to protect them from the beasts that swarmed on their world. No matter how far they've progressed, they're fundamentally still warriors standing watch on their battlements. They don't like outsiders, and their inability to take ideas from other cultures gives them a fundamental disadvantage in warfare.
Sith Lord Freedon Nad conquered this world, setting up a dark side theocracy in Isis, pushing out the natives who would form the resistance fighters known as the Beast Riders, using various powerful creatures to bring the war to the Sith from land, air, and sea. Saw Gerrera was born in this city, Isis, sometime around the mid-40s BBY, and he would have been raised with stories of the heroes of old. Using guerrilla-style tactics, these forces were able to impress the galaxy by defeating the Mandalorian and Sith allied forces. But this history was increasingly mythologized over the centuries, and over the next 4 millennia, all would see Onderonians as a fiercely independent people. By the early 20s BBY, Saw would share a close bond with his sister, Steela, and like most Onderonians, they respected their benevolent and long-reigning King Ramses Dendub. In 24 BBY, the growing tensions in the crumbling Republic caused thousands of star systems to formally secede, forming a new government called the Confederacy of Independent Systems. The next 2 years would see an ever-growing violence, though representatives in each group were still in constant contact and working for peace. King Dendub spent these years assuring his people that Onderon would remain neutral. Even after the Battle of Geonosis in 22 BBY plunged the galaxy into the Clone Wars, the king tried to keep his people calm and optimistic. But Count Dooku would not miss this opportunity to take a world unprotected by Republic forces, a world that would make for a perfect staging area so close to the core. With an overwhelming droid force, he quickly took the capital Isis, and put in place Confederate law, placing the king in prison, and letting the people elect a new king. The problem was the choices were rigged, and Dooku's puppet Sanjay Rash would take the throne. Dooku knew the bureaucratic limits of the Republic and Jedi Council, and just by having an election, he knew that the Senate would be restricted. But Anakin Skywalker was not concerned about the rules. He proposed that the Jedi help train the Resistance fighters loyal to King Dendub. And for once, Windu agrees with Skywalker, but Kenobi and Yoda are blunt in their description of this plan.
That sounds like terrorism, Anakin.
A means to an end. Fear cannot be. Stop those who spread terror. The Jedi must.
What you're suggesting would open up dangerous possibilities, and we must not train terrorists.
Rebels.
Ahsoka is bothered too, picking up on things like mainly effect droids, and that Anakin was so glib in calling this secret initiative by the Jedi to circumvent the local leadership of a planet and get around the Republic Senate.
This could be a great new weapon for us.
He described this morally murky clandestine operation as a great new weapon. Once it is agreed that they will move forward, but only to act as advisors, Kenobi says he is coming with. Shortly after, a new class shuttle made its way through the thick clouds of the Onderonian night, and dropped Kenobi, Skywalker, Ahsoka, and Rex into the lush jungle. And it isn't long before they are spotted by rebels. Ahsoka introduces herself to Saw's sister.
I'm Commander Tano. We're here to help you take back your planet.
They make it back to the rebel base by dawn, and Rex sees that they are not the battle-hardened clones that he was used to working with, but that they weren't shinies either. And Skywalker introduces himself to the apparent leader.
Saw Gerrera.
He fashions himself as our leader, though no one elected him.
As Kenobi asserts that they are not there to fight in this war, Rex promises to teach them some of the tricks and tactics they've learned to take out the Clankers. Ahsoka is surprised, but happy to see Lux Bonteri here. Last time she saw him, he was trying to expose the fact that Dooku killed his mother, the Onderon senator. Lux was willing to turn to Death Watch to get revenge. She developed a crush on him, one which provoked Steela's jealousy. And during this drill against the AAT, Saw shows that he thought of Lux as his greatest rival. Bonteri came from nobler stock. He became a senator like his late mother, and was growing ever beloved in the Gerrera's rebel group, even gaining the affection of Saw's own sister. Saw's feelings towards Lux threatened the success of their group.
You're a terrible soldier, Bonteri.
I'm not sure if they're more interested in fighting the droids or each other.
Steela would have to be a mediator between these two, as the power struggle with these Jedi aides seemed to be hurting his ego too.
Sit down, boy. This isn't the Senate. You've got no talent for this.
And it continued into their work with the Droideka, where technique was more important than power, and both Gerreras failed. Ahsoka was feeling jealous of Steela and Lux's bond, but Saw moved in to get closer to the Togruta.
Hey, Commander. How about, helping me practice?
Once Saw got it, she moved to help reassure the frustrated Steela, before moving on to sniper training. And during the exercise, they spot active battle droids moving in on them. Dozens of B-2 and B-1 droids opened up on the rebel camp, and Anakin was about to launch a counterattack, but Kenobi reminded them of their limits. Though their improvised explosives would take out the first wave, the AAT would blow through their defenses, prompting Steela to release their beasts. Like the rebels of old, the wild beasts of Onderon would rip through the enemy forces, and create an opening for Lux and Saw to work together.
Hey, Bonteri, you ready to try again?
Showing that he could be a unifying leader, Saw gets past their petty rivalry, and compliments the senator. When they all regroup, Lux puts forth the plan to sneak into the capital disguised as hunters and merchants. And when it works, Lux credits Saw for pointing out just how dumb these droids were. Once inside with all their equipment, they are able to ambush droids and fade back into the civilian population. Their Republic advisors were always nearby watching, and giving ideas for more complex ambushes when the target was more heavily defended. All happening within the shadow of the palace. King Rash was starting to lose his cool. He summoned the previous king from his prison cell and accused him of coordinating the insurgency.
Call off the attacks. I cannot call off what I did not dictate.
Meanwhile, the group was celebrating their latest victories, and the Jedi had to warn them that the public were afraid of these attacks, that the public could turn on them if civilians were hurt, or if the king punished them all.
I don't understand. Why are they afraid?
They're afraid we're not strong enough to win. We need to earn their trust.
Ahsoka would be left here to further monitor and train the rebel forces, and knowing that they had to both show strength and improve PR, they set their sights on the main power grid, but needed to know more about the droid's capabilities first.
Those droids should have all the intel we need stored up in those tin cans of theirs, right?
They should.
Then I'll get us one.
By placing an IED in the path of a major droid patrol, it would successfully draw out reinforcements from behind the walled power grid. When they get surrounded, Ahsoka is forced to use her lightsabers to keep from being hit. And this time it is Lex that fails at the grenade roll. Saw pushes him out of the way and draws its fire, while his sister finally takes it out, just as reinforcements finally arrived in the form of an AAT and B2s. With the move Rex taught them, they're able to temporarily disable it, and with a little slicing help from his sister, Saw was able to drive it into position. With excellent sharpshooting and a blast from the tank, the door was open, but the final defense of commando droids came rushing out while the gun recharged, giving Lux a beating and stripping Steela of her pistol, but the Senate boy was able to get a bolt right through the droid circuits. Saw's next shot on target, the power grid was down in a spectacular display of the rebel strength. Hopefully the droids would run out of charge soon, and then the rebels could retake their home. Up above, the king calmly watched the fireworks and declared that he would use this event to his advantage. With night vision supplied by the Republic, the rebels spent the night droid hunting, and before daybreak, the citizens were emboldened enough to openly praise the resistance. In their hidden HQ, the report back to the Jedi and Rex, Skywalker, and Kenobi all agree that the king will hit back hard, but that they have the people's will on their side. Their next move was to push for a leader that the people can love, and Saw smiles in confidence. The unofficial leader could already see himself at the front of cheering crowds lining the streets of his hometown. In the palace, the king was desperately explaining that the rebels were far better equipped and trained than they expected. Dooku was displeased and said that his reinforcements came with a new general as well. One Rash would obey, presenting the T-Series droid Kalani. These tactical droids contained a supercomputer dedicated to the entire known history of war, with some of the most creative AI processing to generate the most likely possibilities in an instant, updating for each new factor detected on the battlefront. While the next wave of CIS forces were preparing, a debate of strategy between Lux and Saw resulted in an unexpectedly passionate speech by Steela, one that pushed the Revelous rebels to vote for their new leader, nearly unanimous in their support for his sister.
Okay, looks like it's been decided. You're the leader.
Saw.
As she races after him, Ahsoka learns for the first time that they are brother and sister. Shortly after, the rebels are placing small holoprojectors around the city and lay in wait for a major patrol. Opening up from the rooftops and behind the stalls of the bazaar, Saw effortlessly takes out a tank while Steela leaps down to give her formal introduction to the people.
Onderon is ours. We need your strength to reclaim our planet and restore our sovereignty under our true king.
King Rash is being driven mad by this open insult, and Kalani is quick to point out that General Tandon's own ranks may be compromised by this message of insurrection. Their egos battle in front of the throne, as the human general reveals their intel on the major players of the rebellion, but the king cuts through it all by announcing that Dendup will be executed in the main square. They all know the intention is to scare the public out of support for the rebellion. Steela says that they should plan to strike during the execution, even if that's what they most expect. But Saul claims he has another idea and defiantly walks away, putting the new leader in an awkward position, to give an order to her brother to stand down. They all plead with him to not do anything reckless, but Saul isn't taking well to his new position.
We can't afford a reckless move right now.
Yeah. Go write a speech about it.
With a grapple hook, he would scale the outer walls to the private quarters that made up Dendup's prison. Feeling triumphant, he made his way to his king, taking a knee to honor the man and reveal his rescue plan. But Saw's hero was not as happy to see him.
Are you one of the meddlers creating disorder, interfering in the affairs of the throne?
When Saw mentions the Jedi's involvement, however, the king feels that they might have a chance at redemption, to finally choose and boldly take sides with the Republic. As they leave, he fires the grapple, but it strikes against a one-way shield, putting the entire compound on full alert with sirens, floodlights, and droids, making it look like the ex-king was definitely in cahoots with the rebels, and now they had just captured one of their most important leaders. Steela's spy sent to watch over Saw reports back that he was captured, and Lux is quick to mobilize everyone to attack the palace, but his sister knows that Saw wouldn't want them to be taken out on a suicide mission. He knew the risks, and they all put down their arms and prepare for their mission to liberate Dendup during the execution. The entire night was spent torturing Saw, with General Tandon warning Kalani that this method would not yield any results, and torturing him to death would only make him a martyr to rally behind. After hours of more electroshock, Tandon brings Saw into a room to try some good cop, giving him a drink and pleading with him that he just wants to protect him from the evil separatists. But Saw would not budge, calling out the general's cowardice and falling in line with this puppet king, and protecting these off-world forces.
I'm not a terrorist. I'm a patriot. King Dendup chose his people instead of taking a side in the intergalactic war. Separatists have taken over Onderon because we let them.
The following morning, what seemed like the entire city was packed into the square to witness the execution of their beloved king. With Magna Guards ready to activate the electro-guillotine, Dendup's head is passed through, and just as the order is given, the rebels spring into action, and Steela is able to get a perfect shot on the guards, and Lux gets smoke grenades out to give the rebels the edge, as they burst through with close-quarters moves to blast and beat their way to the platform and rescue the king and Saw. Plan worked perfectly, but as they split, B2 droids cut some of them down and quickly surrounded them, the T-Series stepping forward to arrogantly demand their surrender. Ahsoka was fighting everything in her Jedi spirit to just watch this without intervening. As the rebels were lined up and about to summarily execute them in front of everyone, above the old general was watching on, and as Dendup was placed back in the guillotine, Ahsoka couldn't hold it. She sprinted forward, gripping her lightsaber, only for General Tandon to come storming down the steps with the palace guards.
Traitor! I was. Not anymore.
That nod to Saw would reassure him that he was right in sneaking into the palace. It had helped in ways he didn't expect. That conversation with his captor led to the old general dragging the false king into the crowd. He also sent his guards away to help protect the rebels. But when the battle droids raised their blasters to them both, Ahsoka spun out of the crowd, defying her master's orders, but in a way that Anakin had done so many times to his own master, fighting to save the individual while disregarding the coldly logical grand plan. She helped the general to escape through the crowd, and as the people heard the calls from King Rash to kill all the rebels, the people rose up and were only held back by the wide-bodied B2s. but at least their plan had worked even better than expected.
Count Dooku will want me dead more than ever.
Then we'll have to teach them another lesson. Together.
The following days would spread the King's message that the rebels were the true sons of Onderon, and was leading to pockets of citizens rising up.
The people are turning against the droids. There's rioting in the streets now.
That's a beautiful thing.
Saw can't wait to use this momentum and take the fight to the clankers in the capital.
We all want victory, but not at the cost of innocent lives. If we fight door to door, no one is safe.
This is war, Steela.
And the King and Ahsoka agree with the sister over the brother. Even from these earliest days in the fighting, we see the attraction to the chaos of war. Surely on the right side of this war, but showing little concern for the people that were caught up in it. In the palace, the furious and humiliated king is planning the counterattack with General Kalani, the droid assuring him that the newly supplied droid gunships would provide the air superiority needed to slaughter all the rebels throughout the thick jungle and mountainous terrain. The land forces would lead the assault, with rows of hundreds of B-1s up front, followed by tanks and B-2s, with commando droids working to execute the pockets that revealed themselves. Just as the rebels were getting cocky with their Ruping Air Force, the HMP's fire made quick work of them and the mounted weaponry. Steela was shaken, and they had to scramble to evacuate their command position. Saw escapes through the canyon and doubles back to see gunships turning on the ground forces. His excellent and daring piloting got him close to one, but only for the shielding to harmlessly disperse the explosion, and its targeting systems quickly locked on and shot him down. Saw tumbling to the battlefront to be whisked away by the old general on his Delgo mount. While countless more of the rebels and allied Onderonian army forces were being cut down, Ahsoka was pleading with Kenobi to send help. The response was that even Windu was cautious against getting involved now. His only advice was to evacuate as many as he could back to Coruscant, and when his comm is cut off, Kenobi tells Anakin that they have to remember that this was supposed to be an experiment, a test to see if the Jedi could covertly train local freedom fighters to oppose CIS advancement. But clearly this was a failure, and they should just learn from this. But Anakin thinks that all they have to do is find some third party to help the Onderonians. And when he thought who could have a bunch of illegal military-grade missiles laying around, his mind went right to Hondo, the Pirate King. Saw and the rest of the group were feeling hopeless, but Steela springs into action before morale could drop too low, ordering new placements to keep the gunships back. And with all the hits to his ego, Saul could see the truth in this moment of darkness.
You really are the best leader among us. Couldn't be more proud of you, my sister.
I learned from the best, big brother.
Just then, a large transport comes storming down on their position. All are terrified, but Ahsoka senses something, and all relax, if still confused, when the pirate comes calmly strolling down to present his gifts.
Rocket launchers.
Shoulder fire? Very expensive.
Commandos open fire on them, and while Steela worries that their base was spotted, Ahsoka thinks it was just a patrol, and they race down to the main battlefront to see how well these things worked. Saw is eager to fire first, and once he gets a lock, he fires without pause, grinning as he watched the shields flicker and fail as the HMP crashed to the ground.
I love this!
Immediately, the morale flips, and they're all ecstatic to shoot down their own gunship, while a frantic call from base reports that the Separatists had found them. Commandos try to extract intel, but the stubborn rebels won't give up the location of the King, and the gunships destroy everything on their path to the door of the HQ. The King is escorted out amid a hail of blaster bolts, and is only saved by an amazing shot from their leader. Saul is dispersing rockets, and his group is able to clear out a trio of HMPs. But relief turns to terror as he watched his target careening towards the King's location. It is likely the highly advanced droid brain on the ship did this on purpose. These ships are droids, just like how some keep fighting even when you chop up their bodies. We've seen before how ships can calculate rapidly the best way to still carry out their mission, whether it be crashing into a hangar to prevent escape, or in this case using the last of its power to use itself as a weapon. The target wouldn't be killed on impact, but the crash caused the cliffside to collapse, and Steela made sure to save the King, and desperately tried to make it back up herself. Saul looked on helplessly as his sister dangled hundreds of feet over the rocky canyon ground. Her boyfriend Lux was just out of reach to help her, and slips and would have fallen to his death if Ahsoka did not pull him up through the Force. Next was Steela, and the Jedi assures her that it was going to be okay. But the will of the droid mind was able to redirect its power just enough to get online and fire a bolt at Ahsoka. Though a weaker shot, it was enough to break her hold on the rebel leader. Though Lux snaps a perfect shot to finally kill the mechanized beast, when they rush to the edge, they see the lifeless body of Steela down below. By the time the rest of the forces get down to her, Saul had been holding his sister and blaming himself for everything.
It was my fault. I shot that gunship down, and it crashed into her position.
Saul, it's not your fault.
Meanwhile in the palace, the war was over with a few sentences by Count Dooku.
A prolonged war does not interest me, General. Their rebellion grows with every small victory.
Shortly after, her entire hometown of Isis and the cities from all over Onderon came to the funeral of their patriotic leader. Saw was the first in line of mourners. No other family are present, likely long dead, perhaps even proxy victims of this clone war too. And Kenobi looks to Saw as his Padawan speaks about the effect this will have on the future.
Steela will be a powerful spirit in their lives.
Yes. For all of us.
And his words to Ahsoka were short.
I'm sorry for your loss.
Thanks, but it's over now. Let's just leave it at that.
And over her body, the true king declares their freedom to Steela's people.
Remember this day, the day Onderon became free again.
A year later would be the final year of the war, 19 BBY, and while entrenched in heavy fighting on Urbana, Skywalker would get an urgent call through his secret encrypted subspace communication frequency, a frequency that was codenamed Fulcrum.
We've received a transmission from someone using our subspace frequency, Fulcrum.
Saw Gerrera.
Perhaps the siege at Onderon has taken a turn for the worse.
No, sir. It's not Gerrera.
With Lux appointed senator by King Dendub and their joining the Republic, Dooku was now attempting a siege, not looking for another ground fight with these Onderonians who had mastered guerrilla-style warfare. This points to Skywalker and or Ahsoka staying in close contact with Saw Gerrera after this incident, as the only people that know this secret frequency are Ahsoka, Kenobi, and Yularen, and now apparently Saw. This call ended up being from Ahsoka, but the fact that he expected it to be Saw points to what I think may be Skywalker hoping to use Saw's expertise to train other guerrilla forces across the galaxy, as this was a tactic that he was clearly fond of and proud to see as a success. An ironic relationship, as that is exactly what Saw would do, and it would be the Sith Lord Darth Vader that would spend the rest of his life hunting down the ever-elusive cells of rebellion. Shortly after this, Clone Force 99 would be deployed to Onderon with false intel from Tarkin.
We have tracked a group of insurgents to the Onderon sector. They must be dealt with.
What sort of insurgents?
Separatist forces.
The Clone Special Forces group was happy to use the increased firepower provided by the Empire, even if they could get a sense that something was off with this new order. They would descend via their stealth transport, the Marauder. More than a year before, the Onderonian saviors were picked up in the dark, thick jungles. But at this point, Saw's resistance against the Empire had already pushed his forces back out of Isis. When the clones get into position, Hunter is skeptical that these are old CIS holdouts.
Tarkin said insurgents, not droids. I'm not sure they're either.
The motley crew of Onderonian civilians were protected by the hardened guerrilla fighters that had swarmed over these elite clones. Hunter was the only one who noticed, and saved all of their lives by ordering Crosshair not to fire. Taken prisoner, they are brought before an unsurprised Gerrera.
They're Republic fighters. Why would Tarkin send us to attack our own forces?
Because we refuse to fight for an empire.
And Saw has to catch them all up to speed on what this new galaxy was really like.
We expected to find battle droids, not
civilians. Times change, targets change.
Though Saw knew that they were not under threat from these ones, their spot was not safe and they needed to move on, explaining that these were the first sparks of the Phoenix of Rebellion. While calling on the memory of all those lost, Steela's spirit still led the fight.
If we give up now, everything we fought for, everyone we lost, will have been for nothing. I won't let that happen. The Clone War may have ended, but a civil war is about to begin.
Desperate for any help, and still hopeful for his old allies, he does not execute these Imperial clones.
Clones once helped us free Onderon, so we'll give them a choice. The old ways are done. You can either adapt and survive, or die with the past.
The problem was that Tarkin was suspicious of Clone Force 99's loyalty, and the Imperial drone saw Hunter disobey a direct order, and see Crosshair be willing to fight his commander over it. For this, the sniper would be promoted, his old squad mates declared traitors, and Crosshair would lead the mission to finish the fight on Onderon. This ragtag group was easily overwhelmed, and brutally executed. Even the trooper that refused to kill the civilians was executed, and this would place one of the earliest Imperial massacres against Saw Gerrera's people, and the first mission of what would become elite trooper forces like the Death Troopers. Imperial Military Command was made up of many of the same Clone Wars leaders, like Wilf Yularen, who knew all too well just how proficient Saw was as a guerrilla fighter. And as Exanto Devo would state, quote, "For years, Saw Gerrera was the most wanted criminal in the galaxy. His rampant terrorist strikes resulted in atrocious civilian casualties, earning him this distinction. He was known to subject prisoners to torture behind the bounds of the Onderon Convention. And he made sure to find allies that agreed with this style, a tactic that would only serve to make civilians feel torn between the corrupt, oppressive order of the Empire and the violent, reckless chaos of Saw's group, now going by the name the Partisans. Early leadership came in the form of Clone Wars vets and mercenaries, and one of these was a Lasat mercenary hired to defend Onderon. He fought off an Imperial platoon under the command of ISB Agent Callus, a fight that radicalized the agent and made Callus even more cold and ruthless than ever.
The boys and I were deployed to Onderon to bring peace and security to a troubled world. We were on a routine patrol and ran into one of your rebel friends, a Lasat mercenary who worked for Saw Gerrera. The Lasat calmly walked through smoke and fire to finish my unit off.
In 17 BBY, Saw would be working out of an unofficial partisan headquarters in the city Jabuto, on the planet Rajtiri. Located in the hidden back room of a seedy cantina, a room that was filled with miscreants of all kinds, noble bounty hunters, smugglers, and rogues, all enemies of the Empire with a lifetime of experience, and with a vast array of skills and connections that were all for sale. One of these smugglers was Haz Obit, and he was trying to pitch a lucrative job to smuggle arms and ammo into an autonomous sector owned by Zerpan Industries, just outside of the corporate sector. Haz Obit was overconfident in the promises of the employer that the rebel allies in the Zerpan checkpoints would just wave them through, a complacency that angered Saw, and he pushed the group to develop a contingency plan in case things went south, and wouldn't let them get off with just timidly saying that he was right.
I'm right, because where most of you have spent your careers steering courses around confrontation, I've flown into the thick of it.
The mission details took an odd turn, and Haz explained that just minutes after they delivered the goods, Imperial ships were scheduled to land there, so they had to maintain a precise timeline, and he was impressed with how quickly Saw understood the true intention of this job, and how directly he explained it to the group.
So, the mission is to land our cargo, wait for the Imperials to arrive, then stand aside while they accuse Zerpan of purchasing stolen weapons. In so many words, Haz said. Saw narrowed his eyes and nodded in a conspiratorial way.
They would be able to get through the checkpoints, and went to work offloading the cargo, pouring sweat as a line of humans, aliens, and droids worked in unison to get weapons through the long cave complex. And Saw talks to Haz about the Imperial control in Onderon, that unlike during the Clone Wars when it was Onderonians versus droids, now they were fighting against each other. Onderonians against Onderonians as loyalist and rebel factions clashed. He asked if it was worth it, but Saw says that the point was never to win a particular battle, but to spark rebellion against the Empire. And while Haz laughs that this is like throwing dirt at an enemy only to get stomped to death, Saw explains,
"If we can persuade enough people to start throwing dirt," realizing that he was supposed to finish the thought, Haz considered it, then said, "Eventually we bury them." Saw grinned at him.
As they finish offloading, Haz realized Saw and the human rebel he was speaking to referred to the fight against him instead of the Empire or them, as they had come to know that Admiral Wilf Tarkin was the cold, efficient imp that was setting these sectors ablaze, outsmarting countless rebel cells and claiming enormous swaths of the galaxy for the Empire, ending millennia of autonomy for many sectors. And Saw gave some parting words of wisdom for the rebel.
"Just remember to keep him guessing. Strike, withdraw, and regroup. You need to keep him as off balance as you can, so he can't gain a foothold."
And again, Saw picks up on a subtle comment from Haz, which was vague in whether he was a true freedom fighter or just a smuggler. So Saw reassures the local rebel.
"Either way, you have my word. I'll be here till it ends."
At this time, Haz Obit was being paid incredibly well by Orson Krennic to smuggle weapons onto worlds that were deemed important to the top-secret Death Star project, codenamed Project Celestial Power. By framing these worlds as rebel allies, and by manipulating his old friend and renowned Kyber energy physicist Jyn Erso, he was able to add rank squares to his chest at a rate that was driving Tarkin mad. The fight with these recently armed rebels was intense, but ultimately a victory that resulted in Obit being captured and Saw Gerrera narrowly escaping. With the help of some powerful chemicals and torture droids, Obit reveals Krennic's plot. He would learn that Obit had become friends with the Erso family, coming to like them during his time using his smuggling skills to get them through dangerous areas. Tarkin would offer Obit immunity if he would work as a double agent against Krennic. And the smuggler loved his first orders from Tarkin, to make the Erso's dream come true and help them escape and hide away in some remote part of the galaxy. Tarkin was confident that eventually other scientists would be able to finish the Death Star project, but Krennic's threat to his own rise had to be addressed immediately. Over the next week, Boba would contact Saw and convince him of the importance of the Erso family, and when he agreed, Tarkin put the plan in motion with a call to Krennic. His arch-nemesis had just left the Erso home, and was stuck in holiday traffic on Coruscant, when the gloating Tarkin explained that he had learned that Haz-Obit was his secret weapon, but had escaped from Imperial control and was last tracked on course to Coruscant. Krennic panicked and sped to the spaceport near the Ersos, finding Haz there looking extremely distressed. Krennic was certain that the smuggler was there to whisk away his lead scientist, but Haz assured him that he was just trying to evade Tarkin. He hadn't sided with the rebels, and just wanted to get down to the lower levels as quickly as possible. Krennic held him for some time, but did realize that the Ersos weren't showing up, so Haz must have been telling the truth. All the while, the most wanted man in the galaxy was making his introduction.
I'm called Saw Gerrera. Yulira, Galen, and Jyn, Galen said, stroking his daughter's hair. Good to meet all of you.
Knowing the truth serum and torture combo the imps like to use, Saw would never tell Haz where he brought the Ersos, and even when Haz later wanted to find out for himself, he avoided contact with Saw out of fears that he was being monitored. While in Gerrera's ship, Jyn was falling in love with space.
But we can go there? If your mom and dad want to. Through hyperspace. He smiled at her. Hyperspace.
As they went back to the cabin, he saw that Mama and Papa Erso's demeanor had finally calmed. They actually looked happy. He told them of the remote, rugged world far from Imperial eyes that they could call home.
What do you think, Stardust? Should Lamu be our new home? Can Saw come and live with us? Papa looked at Saw and smiled. Saw is a very busy pilot, but I'm sure he'll visit us. Right, Saw? Saw nodded and made his eyes smile. Someone needs to keep an eye on you three.
And the hardened, lifelong guerrilla fighter spoke from the heart when he thanked them for fleeing the Empire.
I applaud you, Galen. I applaud all of you for taking a stand. You're my heroes. It's people like you who continue to inspire me to play a part in exposing the Empire's machinations.
Turning to Mama Bear, he handed her a comm card that would allow them to get in contact through heavily encrypted channels if they ever needed him. Saw would leave to regroup with the Partisans and plan a major strike on Kashyyyk. As Imperial advisors sat in newsrooms to guide and edit stories, the most trusted name in Hollow News was being told not to cover what was happening to the Wookiee people. Their top reporter, dubbed the Voice of the Empire, had grown furious at seeing her piece meant to showcase how the Empire betrayed their Clone Wars allies on Kashyyyk, with the Imp advisor applauding her great work on exposing the Wookiee threat, as they edited everything to only cover the violent resistance to occupation. In 14 BBY, a full Imperial blockade was in orbit over the lush world, protecting their crucial Rasher tree sap refinery. When the Jedi survivor Cal Kestis arrived, the partisan Wookiee alliance was in the thick of the fighting.
Oh, that was a close one, kid. Aren't you supposed to be watching the monitors?
Guerrilla fighters, Wookiees and off-worlders ambushing an Imperial convoy.
After the boy hijacked an AT-AT, he was able to turn the Imp's superiority against themselves, earning himself the respect of the galaxy's most wanted man.
Hey! Who are you?
Someone who just brought an AT-AT to the table. Who are you?
Someone making the Empire angry.
As they clear the place of Stormies, Saw introduces himself to this unexpected ally.
Saw Gerrera. What are you doing on Kashyyyk?
Looking for somebody. What are you doing here?
My companions and I came to Kashyyyk to disrupt Imperial supply lines. Who are you looking for?
A Wookiee chieftain named Tarful.
Tarful is impossible to find. There's a reason he's evaded the Empire for this long.
He's a freedom fighter?
He's the freedom fighter.
And Gerrera explains that some of the Wookiee slaves being forced into labor were members of Tarful's resistance. And after Cal does free a large group, we get another glimpse at the cold, practical mindset of Gerrera.
We need their help to stop the Empire. For the prisons! We need the Wookiees to finish this! We need the Wookiees to win this!
No one doubted his bravery or ability, but winning the war was the first and only priority, leading him to treat people as means to this end. Hardened by the losses over the years, he surely looked at himself this way too, but it resulted in a lack of concern for the individuals. Even Cal's mentor had reservations about Saw.
He's fighting a losing battle. I doubt freedom for the Wookiees is his only goal.
Have either of you heard the Partisans?
Rumors and cantinas, but not much to go on.
They call them radicals. Yeah, I heard the Empire's got bounties on their heads.
Though none could deny his charisma.
These have been hard years. We've lost comrades, friends, family to the Empire. Dark times. And yet the fire still burns. Hope still burns. The Jedi are not yet lost. We are not yet lost. Kashyyyk is not yet lost. For the cause!
A year later, he would get the emergency call he had been fearing. The Empire had finally found the Ersos, and Krennic would personally arrive to plead with his old friend to come peacefully. The scientist knew the life would be won as a prisoner, from Wookiees working hard labor to top scientists in high-tech labs and plush penthouses. No matter how low or high-ranking you were in the Empire, you knew you were a slave to the Emperor.
So we were this close to providing peace, security for the galaxy.
You're confusing peace with terror.
Well, you have to start somewhere.
Lyra would not stand for this, and Jyn saw everything, though she would perfectly follow the plan that her parents and Saw had trained.
If the worst happens, and you need help but Papa and I aren't around, you press this button here, and Saw Gerrera will come.
And as she held her Kyber necklace, she remembered her teaching to trust the Force, and trust her training.
My child, come. Come. We have a long ride ahead of us.
Part 2. As she climbed out, she remembered how strict her mother was with the emergency comm button.
And every time, Jyn would reach out for the button, eager to hit it right then. "He never visits," she'd say as Mama pulled her back, chiding her daughter that he was to be summoned in emergencies only.
Saw grabbed her and raced back toward their homestead. All scans showed the imps were long gone, but he needed to make sure that no intel remained in the home. He cursed as he saw how thorough these troopers were. Every nook and cranny, hidden spots under the floors and walls were all ripped open. And Jyn confirmed that the file bank and her papa's safe were missing. At only 8 years old, Saw was impressed with how well her parents had prepared her for this hard life. The girl critiqued herself for not counting how many troopers had appeared, and for failing to spot their ship and weaponry, but the brief shootout was emblazoned in her mind, and she did recognize Krennic. After Saw was convinced the house was clear, he dropped a thermal detonator as they walked out. The girl looked back as the home exploded and was consumed in flames. Saw noting that this little one was stronger than a lot of the rebel wannabes in the soft imps he'd faced over the years. No crying or hysterics at all this loss, just a somber focus, and he thought he could work with this. He sat the girl beside him in the cockpit and could almost read her mind as she looked in on the Star Destroyer gleaming off in the distance. She knew her father was on that ship, and she also knew that it would take less than a minute for their ship to jump to hyperspace. But still, Saw was cursing and scrambling, worried about the extra range and suite of sensors in a full-on Imperial 1 class capital ship. But they would be able to pop into that blinding blue void safely. By this point of 7 years of fighting, she noted how hard his features were. The scars on his face and the calluses on his hands were nothing compared to his meaner look, and it became even stonier when he demanded to know more about her dad's work.
"I don't want to talk about it." "Too bad," he said, "because I need to know why the Empire came after your father like that." "You knew why my parents went into hiding," Jyn said. "I knew bits, but I had no idea they'd send a Star Destroyer after him."
Saw keeps pushing her to think, but all she knows is that it works with crystals like the ones on her neck. He knew there had to be way more to this than just some mineralogical interest, and she too knew that the fear Papa had toward his work, and the fight with Mama over its role meant it was something bad. She also thought back to the drills they would run, and that there wasn't one where she lost both her parents, but it occurred to her that that wasn't entirely true. It's just that it wasn't said explicitly. She realized that
they hadn't wanted her to think about just how bad things could get. But Jyn knew it to be true. Saw was her last hope.
He tried to shoot her a reassuring smile, but then he said,
"I don't know what to do with you, kid." And any comfort she'd felt disappeared.
Saw piloted them through a deadly maze of the asteroid cloud that covered the planet Rhea. They landed on a thin strip of land jutting out of the ocean, a cold island with jagged plants and spires of rocks surrounding the landing zone, so tall that it made you feel like you were in a deep canyon. A biometric lock opened a door carved into a rock, and the dim light showed that this outpost was a long tunnel connecting 3 large rooms, all carved through solid rock, and without any touches to make it feel like home. Jyn said he should get a droid to help them clean, and his response was short.
I dislike droids.
Saw was shuffling all sorts of furniture and grabbing things from the large room with 6 beds in it, before setting her up in a tiny, dusty, smaller room. She felt slighted, like he was storing her out of the way, but his eyes were still kind.
He looked so anxious for her approval that all she could do was whisper her thanks.
When she woke up, she realized she was alone in this dim, carved-out cave, and felt a little bad as she snooped through the work table, seeing ship schematics pushed aside in favor of a datapad full of intel on kyber crystal research, including a picture of her papa. She started to fear she had been abandoned here and made her way outside only to hear Saw training. He was working through the jagged terrain, sprinting, rolling, fighting, and blasting his way through several old battle droids. After the last of the Clone Wars relics had been knocked off their stands, Jyn realized that this was why her parents wanted her to reach out to Saw, not because they were all best friends, but because of these skills.
Can you teach me how to fight like that? Jyn asked. Darling, he said, grinning. That's the plan.
He was impressed with her extensive knowledge of droid models, as she knew these weren't all Clone Wars relics. Some were obscure and rare droids like the CB-3 Cortosis droid, new Imperial KX Enforcer droids, and the IGRM War droid. Saw would graduate her through the basics of shooting and fighting, then to battlefield movement and tactics, and even simulate the enemy by throwing sticks and rocks, and weeks would go by before she even thought about learning something else. But when she did remember her more traditional homeschooling, Saw gave her a datapad and said she would have to teach herself. And when she asks why they train against droids if the stormtroopers are all people now, Saw's answer is subtle and cold.
The Empire learned how to fight in a war against droids, he said. Droids and clones. It helped them to forget that war is about people.
His point is that the Empire still sees their enemies as just droids, not conscious individual people. And while it might look like he is showing empathy and concern for people caught up in this war, his point is the opposite, that the rebels, partisans, whoever wants to fight the Empire, needs to adopt this same philosophy. These stormtroopers were mindless drones following orders just like the old enemy. The Empire had every advantage imaginable, from numbers to propaganda, credits and firepower, and what Saw was trying to get through people's heads, like the silly, idealistic Mon Mothma and Jedi that he had met, was that they could not afford to let the Empire have this philosophical advantage on top of all that. He would train Jyn and his partisans to be equal with the Imps in the only area they could be, by dehumanizing their opponent, to see these battles as just plain facts. The innocent civilians that died in these fights would save countless trillions of people in future generations. The very next day, she woke up to see Saw had strung up stormtroopers' complete armor sets, and she wasn't even sure if bodies were still in there, and Saw handed her the blaster. Her mother always said that if she had to fire at a person, always set it to stun, and she instantly switched it, but Saw moved to force her hand and put it back.
Never do that, he said in a gentle voice. If you're going to shoot a blaster, you always shoot to kill. Always.
He then handed her the club, and when she swung with all her might, she confirmed these were just empty shells of a stormtrooper. With each swing, she grew tired and eventually collapsed in exhaustion. Frustrated, she tells Saw that she can just use a blaster. He was no longer gentle. He stared in her eyes, as he said he has seen rebels use sticks and stones to bring down blasters and cannons. She would learn to call back the memory of the troopers that killed her mother, as she clubbed each of the targets into submission. A month later, a ship would land and drop off people that acted like this was home sweet home, all surprised to see her, and they brought their own food, making fun of how only Saw could survive on these nutrient shakes, however efficient they might be. The man that had an Onderonian accent opened up a large star chart and pointed out areas that his group had surveyed. Christophsis had nothing of note, but Ilum was getting an insane amount of Imperial attention.
Jyn Erso is a known supporter of the Empire, Reese said dismissively. He's a respected scientist, but I don't see how crystals... crystals are more powerful than you may think.
They had talked about the fact that nobody could learn that she was an Erso, and though she defied Saw's clear orders to go back to her room, she listened to the partisan speech, the man thinking her father was an Imperial loyalist, and all laughed at how those old Jedi crystals couldn't be too powerful if the Jedi were all dead. Saw pushed that there was something here they needed to look into, but the group didn't see it.
Saw, buddy, you're reading too much into this. Galen Erso is a shill. That's not true, Jyn shouted. Papa wouldn't work for the Empire like that. He's a good man. They kidnapped him.
Saul tried to deflect and grabbed her shoulder to push her back into the room, but he couldn't stop her from angrily blurting out that the Empire kidnapped her papa, and that her papa was a good man. Later, away from the group, he told her that all their intel pointed to Galen helping to build the Empire some new, strange weapon, and he wasn't fully convinced that Galen was still a good man. And after repeated resistance, he finally reveals what his spies had discovered.
Galen Erso is working alongside Orson Krennic.
The little girl that seemed so hardened since that day on Lamu was now crying hard and screaming.
Mama died! She screamed. I watched her be killed by that man, and Papa works for him now? By all appearances, they're friends.
For minutes, she would lash out at him with every martial art technique she had learned, punching, kicking, slamming into him and pounding with her fists.
And when she started to tire, he wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, and just held her.
Knowing that her hope that any morning she could wake up to her papa picking her up out of bed, he knew this hope would only hurt her, and he wanted to say it out loud for her.
He's not coming for you, Saw said. You can't trust him.
3 years later, in 10 BBY, Saw's contacts would bring him to the attention of Enfy's Nest, who had just come into the possession of one of the rarest hyperfuels in the galaxy, coaxium. He agreed to come alone, but when someone was heard shuffling about in the shuttle, Jyn was nearly blasted into stardust by the pirate guards.
Your ward?
Yes. She's 11, but she needs to learn.
Enfy was thoroughly perplexed by this sight of a grizzled old vet and timid young girl, and not critiquing but genuinely wondering, she kept asking why he would bring her along to such a dangerous meeting if she's just a child.
Many people treat age as if it's a shield to hide behind. Something that protects our children. And sometimes it is. Until someone comes along who doesn't honor the shield.
Enfy agreed and told Jyn to promise that she would make those that doubted her pay dearly.
They're going to underestimate you. Make them regret it.
Enfy also knew of the recklessness of Saw's style.
I would hope that you would be more precise in your ways, Saw, she said. You're going to need some attention to detail if your fight is going to work.
And after he kept insisting, she had him promise not to waste it, reminding him it could fuel an entire fleet and would normally cost 60 million credits, or 40 CR-90 Corvettes. 4 years later, in 6 BBY, the radicalization of the Partisans was starting to frighten some of Saw's oldest allies. After one meeting in his Rhea hideout, he was explaining to his leadership corps that they needed to have multiple hideouts, and even they didn't know that this rocky location was just one of many, Saw always being a man with contingency plans and redundancies in place. A female that had become a motherly figure for Jyn was explaining that Saw was right after all, that these kyber crystals were being harvested from every source available, and even similar minerals were being completely bought up. Ilum was the most obvious example, but many other unheard of worlds were being strip-mined and hollowed out. Her spies reported that the last shipment of crystals was a complete Imperial parade, with people flown in from Onderon and Chandrila particularly, including essentially ordering their senators to attend, and she rightly concluded that the Empire must have been using them as human shields, especially being from the two worlds most critical of the Empire and constantly connected to rebel cells. So if these senators were killed, they could use rebels to kill rebels, and likely shift sentiments back on their homeworlds to be less supportive of the rebellion. She jokingly imagines how incriminating the HoloNet reports would be.
I can see what the HoloNet would show on the feeds now. Anarchists risk lives of senators. Partisans embrace terrorism. You should.
She tries to throw in some nuance that he can't really mean that, but he doubles down.
Are you saying we should actually become a terrorist organization? that we should slaughter anyone between us and the Empire. Why not? Saw asked. That's how they'll spin it anyway, right, Jyn?
In only the time it took to have this heated conversation, Jyn was sitting there on her datapad using her slicing skills to show just how easy it was to spread convincing propaganda. And Drissa was impressed and a little shaken at how official it looked. And Saul bragged about how they understood how to really fight this war. He laughed out loud when she mentioned that the Senate was still hoping to avoid an open civil war.
They don't realize we're still fighting the same war as before. We never quit fighting.
Even Saul couldn't fully appreciate how true this was, that Darth Sidious was the true enemy from before the Clone Wars, all the way through to this present day. And she promises they all did stop fighting.
War is war, and it never ends.
He knew he exploded a bit too hard this time, and went to get a bottle to calm his nerves.
You remind me of Steela. That's not entirely a compliment.
They shared a drink and talked as if they hadn't fought at all, more somber and almost desperate to be understood. The next day, Jyn was asking endless questions, and even through a heavy hangover, he wasn't angry or even proud, just desperate to explain how he thought this jumble of rebellious cells had to act, fearing a unified force and all the bureaucracy that brought with it, let alone vectors for spies and traitors to bring it all down. But if there really was to ever be a rebel alliance, it had to revolve around a charismatic leader that they believed in, someone they cared about. And he told her that millions of people died in the Clone Wars. It made her see that honestly she didn't feel any deep emotion at this statistic.
You feel nothing because you didn't know any of them, did you? Jyn shook her head. But I tell you that my sister died.
He went on to say that he was the one that shot down the gunship that put all this into motion, saying with that story, you feel something, wiping a tear from Jin's cheek, saying Steela's body was barely cold before the Republic became the Empire, and it was just more war and more death. He says that the only thing that could unite a rebel alliance would be someone like her. Jyn thinks this means great fighters like Steela.
They need more fighters like her to die like she did, he growled. The Resistance needs a martyr, a tragedy, something so horrific that people can't help but stand up and fight too.
At this time, Saul had spent several years trying to reveal what this massive project was that involved Erso and the planets full of kyber crystals. He knew it was important, but didn't know that this superweapon would end up providing this tragedy, making an entire world a martyr that the galaxy could rally behind. The next day, the old group of partisan allies showed up, and one of them Jyn was coming to loathe was an undisciplined 25-year-old leader of the group named Reese. He seemed to go out of his way to annoy her, and though 10 years her older, when they got into an argument, Saul told them to take it outside and resolve it, and says as the pair get in the impromptu circle that this is just a spar. Though she got some excellent strikes in with her greater technique, the young man was just too big and strong, and with a couple parries he was able to smother her on the ground, ripping off her kyber crystal necklace and taunting her, prompting Jyn to smash the side of his head with a rock. When Reese complains that was cheating and limped off to his friends, Saul complimented her on the use of her pointed stick, a reference to something Steela said about being able to take out a greater enemy if you had the will to grab any weapon possible, that there were no rules to a fight. She would wait until they left the next morning, and Saul gave her a cloth to cover up her crystal, saying this was becoming too big of a threat. People know she wears a kyber, her mother gave it to her, and her dad Jyn Erso was a good man. Jyn doesn't think his own people would betray him, a naivete that he harshly corrects, and tells her simply that most of these allies just did it for the credits, and if the Empire ever wanted to find Galen's daughter and use her as blackmail, they could pay far more than Saul could ever dream. That being said, he knew it was time to bring her along for her first mission, and he beamed with pride as she provided fake docs and codes to transmit, and the tense crew all sighed in relief when the girl's work came through. With this, they were able to raid a ship and extract intel from scientists that worked on Ilum. Jyn was supposed to guard the ship and hesitated to shoot a scientist that tried to push onto the partisan ship. One of the other partisans took the shot, but since Saul looked up and saw her shaken with a raised blaster in her hands, he assumed she had taken her first kill, and her proud foster dad was talking her through how it could be traumatic, but right. She could barely hear him, as she was beating herself up for not taking the shot, remembering that her mother was ready to, and did fire on Krennic. The next series of missions were either too dangerous or didn't require her skill set, so she sat alone for weeks sometimes, hating the isolation. When Saw came back heavily scarred and with a broken leg, he was more short-tempered than ever, snapping at everyone. And she was even more hurt when she realized that she was actually relieved when he left again. Many of the Partisans were now living in their rocky home, quickly becoming too crowded, and Saw had to let her grow with the younger ones, playing games, making friends and rivals, drinking her first sip of alcohol, and picking up their various skills in combat and real-world knowledge. Saw gave her a surprise test with all the components of a detonator and gave her 3 minutes to build it with everyone watching. She failed and was embarrassed to her core. She snapped at Saw that this was a stupid test, and his look of disappointment was intense. The teenager complained to her friends that Saw hated her, but shortly after this, she was surprised that he had handed her a sniper rifle, with a battery pack large enough to overcharge the shot, and a breakdown of a man who was known to work on Kyber research. Saw might have been just as terrified for her first solo mission, but she would return. The man of endless contingencies had put her there as insurance. Explosives actually took out her target, and Jyn eagerly looked through the scope and was both glad and somehow disappointed that she didn't have to fire. The next months would see her going on even more missions, and was surprised to hear that they were going to the Mid-Rim world in Usagi. She worked to forge invites to a major celebration event, a native holiday being used to introduce their first Imperial governor, Governor Toffervin. He was a close friend to Palpatine, and this world was near Naboo, so a strike here would send a message to the Emperor. But Jyn was horrified by the partisan style. After getting everyone in place, she watched as the 10 shooters got into their position, knowing they carried FC-1 flechette launchers, a weapon that fired 6 grenade-like shots, each dispersing hundreds of razor-sharp darts that could punch through Durasteel, and Jyn knew this meant they could go through several bodies before they slowed down. Her last thoughts as the governor was announced and the golden petals of celebration exploded over the crowd was, quote, 10 people, 60 shots, thousands of tiny razors flying through the air.
10 people, 60 shots, thousands of tiny razors flying through the air. In mere minutes, the floor was covered in blood and bodies.
On the flight home, she had her first real fight with him over what it was that they were really doing.
This was a murder mission, Saw, Jyn told the dead rocks floating in space. We weren't fighting for good, or supporting the resistance, or taking down the Empire. That was a massacre. Oh, Jyn, Saw said, his voice cracking. What do you think war is?
None of this troubled him at this point in the war, and Jyn also noticed their own casualty rates were increasing. Her best friend died in that massacre. Others that she assumed were just off on other missions for a while ended up dead, even a pair of invincible-looking Gamorreans. Soon after this, Saw would officially form the Partisans from old allies on the Onderon resistance, and one of the first missions would hire a Lasat mercenary to strike an Imperial platoon. This attack was so savage and complete that only ISB agent Callus survived, leading to his personal hatred of the Lasat species, and a burning rage against all rebel groups that did help to accelerate him through the Imperial ranks, remembering the ruthlessness of the rebels he faced and thus continuing this cycle of violence. Despite Saw's victory, the ease with which the Empire replaced these dead troops and vehicles resulted in even greater imposed lockdowns. It all convinced him that there was no hope for liberating Onderon. The entire Empire would have to be destroyed. And after the heist on Aldhani, the enigmatic Luthen asks if it was another of Saw's brazen strikes.
Would I be out here in the cold if I had just pinched 100 million credits?
That's exactly what you do.
And the man really knew Saw, from playing on his love of great, bold plans.
It was a masterpiece.
Wow, now I'm sure.
To complimenting how the Partisans were rolling in credits.
Nothing with you is free.
Not every operation is as flush as yours.
And he knows Gerrera's core flaw.
I work alone.
That's what I'm trying to change.
I'm not going to put my people at risk.
But he did think like Saw more than most of the other so-called rebels. He wanted a major op that would trigger massive Imperial oppression and thus create more rebels.
We need the Empire to help. We need them angry. We need them coming down hard. Oppression breeds rebellion.
And the more Luthen pushes, the more it drives Saw mad at how nobody else can see how these fractured groups all had their own special interests.
Krieger's a separatist. My pay's a neo-Republican. The Gorman Front, the Partisan Alliance, sectorists, human cultists, galaxy partitionists. They're lost! All of them, lost!
And he used this to get to a question that had been bothering him about his shady friend bearing gifts.
I've never really known. What are you?
Luthen tries again, echoing something he knows Saw believes, that there may be a point that the Empire becomes too powerful. But when he critiques Saw's anarchism as a luxury coming from his out-of-touch, secluded lifestyle, Saw is done.
No sale today, Luthen. Good luck with Anto Krieger.
Some weeks later, when Luthen tries again, Two Tubes had everybody on high alert, explaining that Saw was in a mood. Saw was manically screaming out orders to get everyone prepared. After all the critiques last time, now he wanted to work with Krieger. But Luthen explains that there was a problem.
ISB knows Krieger's plan. They'll be waiting for it.
And this is another troubling potential clue to Luthen's identity.
Which means either you're ISB, or you have someone inside that you are protecting.
That he couldn't expose Luthen like Saw could. Saw could make the choice to go forward, but Luthen was clearly shook by the ISB learning of the strike.
You have people everywhere, don't you?
By even doubting Tubes, Luthen shows him that this is how the ISB will react if they warn Krieger. They will trust no one. Resistance fighters will lose their informants, some may even be exposed and killed. And Saw agrees to this, showing that they are rare among the Resistance, not idealistic and reckless, but cold and effective.
Call it what you will.
Let's call it war.
Saw developed an even more intense training regimen for anyone that visited their island HQ. Many left, few of the newcomers would stay on, and he started to get hints that his group of spies and credit-hunting mercs were learning more about Saw's mysterious daughter. One of the original partisans that Jyn met was put through lengthy torture sessions, and Saw revealed that he knew she was an Erso. That man was killed, and he told the group that Jari was an Imperial spy. To cover it, they tied him up and had his men dump the body off in an Imperial barracks, Saw acting like he was sending a message to the imps. During this time, Idrissa would visit and chastise him for massacres, that all it did was ending up being a PR win for the imps, and worked to further restrict the rights of regular citizens. Then she got to the real point of why she came. Her wannabe Rebel Alliance friends were unwilling to help the people of Tamsi Prime.
You had such ideals. How's that working now? When you see people who need help, but the best thing you can do is just hope someone like me will pick up the slack.
But she still pushed that if only she could get intelligence on the ground, maybe the general would reconsider, and reluctantly, he eventually agreed. While planning this mission, he realized this planet was the old site of shell munitions used during the Clone Wars. Explosives based on gunpowder, considered more crude and ancient than plasma, but was one of the shell types fired from ATTE walkers, with slug throwers and shell artillery having their own unique advantage against some armors and shields. Saw had witnessed this type of munition take down whole mountainsides, but the intel pointed to these factories processing the types of metals he had been tracking. The Empire was trying to conceal their production and movement across the stars, Saw believing it must be related to an experimental superweapon that Jyn's father was still working on. Nobody can figure out how they slipped past the blockade of Star Destroyers, and Saw has to explain the imp tactic of making sure these worlds they wanted kept a secret had all of their needs met by that population, which was great for job security there, but everyone knew this was so that if rebellion popped up here, they could not claim that it was some outside meddling force, and punishment would be exacted on their own world immediately. Saw explained that that's a funny part of fighting for ones you love, that it simultaneously makes you want to fight more, and makes you more afraid to fight at all. The look in his eye made Jyn realize he wasn't thinking back to the Clone Wars, but maybe he meant her. Back on the ship, when being transported with her real mama and papa, when Saw thanked their parents for their heroic stance, he mentioned how you needed to fight for the world we leave for our children. Eventually, they were able to get a cover with Reese's rebel friend working on Coruscant, who was set to film a propaganda holo on the target world. With Jyn's scanned docks they were in, and in no time they were trotting around the facilities with the Imperial officer in charge. They were very clearly led away from some buildings, and Jyn tells Saw that it looks like some of the tools her father used, but way bigger versions of them. Reese doesn't hear what they say, but makes a face that seems odd to her, and she wasn't sure why, but she thought of how he knew of her Kyber necklace, and that Saw was worried that people would find out she was Galen's daughter. Moments later, they are brought into the heart of the facility, and stormtroopers came to surround them.
Saw Gerrera, Reese said. Lieutenant Colonel Senjax's eyes were alight. This is excellent, he said. That name has been on our lists for quite some time. This was a setup?
The little boy's ego was hurt from Reese's old group, all wanting to form up under Saw's Partisans, and the loss to Jyn in that fight all those years ago didn't help. Reese says Indra wasn't in on it, just a gullible fool, and as soon as the traitors started to explain that the girl may be the daughter of, Saw had moved so fast that he stripped the stormtrooper's blaster and dropped Reese before the others even reacted. The weapon was only on stun, but even more were hit with the blue pulse, as Jyn pulled a knife and went to work herself. This squad was down, but more were racing towards them. Saw grabbed Lieutenant Colonel Senjax and put the blaster to his skull, telling Jyn to grab Reese. They moved through cover, but were shocked to see TIE fighters blasting through the facility, showing no concern for collateral damage to the workers or even the equipment. The Imp laughed that this place was about to be demolished soon anyways, and with the most wanted rebel in their grasp, it was worth it to kill everything in sight and just search through the rubble later. As laser cannons hit near them, the officer breaks away and runs for it, while random bolts of green lasers set off massive batteries and sensitive equipment. The chain reaction turns the entire facility into a shrapnel grenade as concrete, glass, and metal blast towards them. Saw tackles Jyn to cover her, and she starts to feel soaked in his blood. This was followed up by chemicals raining down and burning through his skin. These sealed themselves, but then she saw the jagged rod of metal that was impaled through his shoulder and out through his chest. Slipping in Saw's blood, she points the blaster at Reese to get up and help her move him. As the Force would have it, the traitor was mostly unscathed, and they were able to get him moving and call to Cordo, waiting in their ship. He runs out to help them, and Saw is becoming more alert. He turns to the traitor and yells in a deep, animalistic growl that he will take care of Reese, but that Jyn needs to hide. He puts a small blaster and knife into her hands, and says to hide in a shell turret until daylight.
You're not leaving me behind, are you?
She starts to panic, and thought about how he had been growing more paranoid, and the way he was able to turn on Partisans before. She sprinted to the turret and looked out to see a grin light up on Saw's bloody face, as he got on top of Reese and used his knife to peel the traitor's face back, before stabbing into his shoulder and spinning the blade to mimic his own injury, screaming at the man the whole time. Reese looked alive, and he was dragged into their stolen Lambda-class shuttle. Shooting down a TIE in pursuit, they slipped through the atmosphere, and Jyn was alone. Part of her mind tried to reassure her that he would come to rescue her, like he did 8 years ago on Lamu, but somehow she knew that wasn't true. Alone at 8 years old, and now alone again at 16, she would have to rely on herself to survive. In 3 BBY, the Partisans targeted Moff Quarsh Panaka. The old Naboo security vet was known to be one of the most loyal servants of fellow Naboo native Emperor Palpatine. The Organas were meeting with the Naboo Queen Dalni, and the explosion went off only minutes after they all met with the Moff. Bail and Bria were furious with Saw, as this is exactly the kind of reckless abandon that was leading Command in the Alliance to push to cut all ties with Saw, and what made it harder to do good PR for the rebellion. Leia was 16 at the time, and felt that Panaka was still at the core a good man, and importantly, he was one of the highest ranking imps that was still on good terms with Mon Mothma and the Organas. Leia lied to the imps that came racing in after the explosion, allowing the partisan bombers to escape. When she asked if her parents were involved, the Organas were now mad at her for thinking that they would fight like partisans. But unbeknownst to all of them, this assassination helped save the identity of Leia Skywalker. As the head of security for her birth mother for so many years, Panaka was stunned to see that the current queen had let Leia wear the jubilation dress for the meeting. After their long conversation in the office, he came to think that this might be the lost daughter of Amidala. Few knew she was even pregnant. Fewer still knew that the body was made to just look pregnant, and Panaka wasn't sure whatever happened to this child. Luckily for the rebellion, the explosion took his life just seconds after he had the thought to inform the Emperor of his suspicion. And Leia's adoptive mother made sure she knew that Saw's methods were not the way she should fight against evil. A year later, Saw would find himself hunting down this lead on the sandy Outer Rim world that changed his life forever. The clues on this superweapon brought him to Geonosis, where the Clone Wars began, and somehow these bugs were again involved in creating something that would set the galaxy ablaze. When the rebel cell known as the Spectres reported that the Geonosian population was eradicated, some would think this meant the bugs were enemies of the Empire. The But at this point, Saw's gut told him that this meant that they were so deeply involved they could not be left alive. The Alliance was working with Saw on this mission, and when they lost contact with the team, the Spectres were asked to investigate. When they split up to search the last known location of Saw's group, in an odd energy reading a few kilometers away, the team of Rex, Kanan, Ezra, and Chopper reached the building where Saw's comms went out, and Kanan asks how Rex knows Gerrera.
So Rex, how do you know Saw Gerrera?
Oh, we go way back. They were part of a plan to help localized militias fight for themselves against the Separatists. She didn't make it, but he carried on, and even started his own rebel cell after the Empire took over.
As they get deeper into the rocky complex, Rex sees the Partisan-marked helmets. Further along, they see more abandoned gear, and are ambushed by B-1s and a droideka. There's nothing the Jedi and clone can do but hold off fire from the shielded droid, when suddenly an explosion in the tunnels knocks it down, short-circuiting the shield generator, and the rest of the droids are flanked. When the smoke clears, Rex sees the war-torn face and body of that once cocky kid on Onderon.
Captain Rex, so, you decided to come to Geonosis after all?
Yeah, to rescue you.
Is that what's happening?
Saw thanks them all and is amazed to see 2 Jedi. He explains that there was a Geonosian left, and he was keeping a large CIS shield generator operational, and was maintaining the battle droids that killed Saw's forces. When Kanan wants to leave, Saw says that this single bug may hold the key to the mystery that he had been tracking for nearly a decade.
We know the Empire wiped out the entire population of this planet. We need to find out why. The Empire is hiding something important, and that bug knows what it is.
Rex and Ezra agree with Saw, but they do stop to warn Hera and the second team about the droid forces.
But we have to warn Hera about the droids first.
I can help you with that. This way.
With a little help from the Force, Ezra is launched over the cavern that separated Saw from his bug target. And with a lot of help from the Force, Kanan is able to hold out a bridge segment long enough for Saw and Rex to make it over.
Come on, we gotta get moving.
I always forget they can do that.
Yeah, but he's not a Skywalker.
I heard that.
It isn't long before they spot their target, and Saw rushes to get the bug talking, thinking of the squad mates he just lost and all these years of obsession.
Tell me what I want to know, Bug. What Imperial secret was worth the lives of my team, my friends?
When Rex tells him to calm down, Saw calls on the Geonosians' role in the Clone Wars.
You know better than anyone, we can't underestimate these things.
The bug can understand them, but they just hear a complex series of clicks. The bug desperately draws a small circle and set in a larger circle, and Rex thinks it may symbolize Geonosis and the asteroid ring. Ezra tells them that Chopper picked up on the energy source even further down, and before they head there, Saw slaps cuffs on Click-Clack to make sure that he can't escape. In the scuffle, Saw dropped a hollow picture of his sister and snapped on Ezra when he tried to return it.
Steela, this is all I have left of her.
The energy signature turned out to be the Geonosians' home, full of scrap parts and a computer terminal. While the rebels contacted their friends, Saw was frantically ripping through everything for something Imperial. When Click-Clack moves toward a container, Saw tosses him back and demands to know what he's hiding. Rex tries to calm him, but Saw pulls out a sonic blaster from behind where the bug was reaching.
Still think the bug's our friend? What else you got in there?
But with more digging, the bug ripped away and rushed to cradle an egg. Ezra says this must be what he was so protective of, and since it was a queen egg, it was the only hope for the survival of his species. Hera calls back to immediately evac as Imperial forces were on their way to the surface. They argue over what to do with Click-Clack, and Saw is not about to let him go, even saying he will use the egg as leverage to learn what he wants. The rest all believe the drawing of the circle within a circle was just meant to show the egg, but Saw knows there is some deeper mystery here.
Ezra's right. They don't deserve extinction.
The mission takes priority.
Saw, we had this argument back at command. Your mission was to find out what happened here.
And I'm gonna make this bug tell me exactly that.
Hinting at Saw's push to tie all these missions back to his search for Erso's superweapon. And with more self-righteous whining from the young Jedi, Saw snaps at him.
I know some people in this rebellion don't want to admit it, but we are in a war, and war is loss.
TIE bombers made up the first wave of attacks and forced the Ghost to attempt a risky descent into the rocky cavern hole, just barely enough to fit the transport. As Saw's group moves, Ezra thinks Click-Clack knows a shortcut, but to prove just how much he hated the bug, Saw sides with a droid.
We follow the droid.
Seconds later, they arrive at their ship, and Kanan makes the introductions, with Saw proud to meet the famed Hera Syndulla.
Phoenix Leader, I'm honored to meet you. Your actions have not gone unnoticed among the ranks of other rebels.
Neither have yours.
This laugh and careless attitude to Hera, bringing up what most would consider war crimes, was the reaction that scared many other rebels, and convinced them that there was not an ounce of internal conflict or regret over innocent lives that were written off as collateral damage. And he gets suspicious when Hera starts to question what should be done with the Geonosian.
We need to be careful. From what I hear, Saw's got a reputation for being a little extreme.
Considering his past, can't say I blame him.
And this is interrupted by an impromptu torture session with Saw's stun cuffs.
I'm taking your shuttle and the bug. Your methods are soft, Jedi. We lost the last war because of you. I won't lose this one.
The brawl turns him against Ezra, and even Rex tries to nicely get him to calm down, only to be flipped, and the Shocks finally free the egg, allowing Saw to take it hostage. With a blaster pointed at the only hope for the species, he pleads to the other rebels to agree.
Our enemy shows no mercy. Neither can we.
If you harm that egg, you're helping the Empire wipe out the last of his kind. The last of his family.
Their shared enemy arrives overhead and ends the debate. Hera gets Saw to focus on the immediate threat, and he does hand the egg back to the bug. And with blaster in hand, he joins Zeb and the Jedi to fight off the incoming rocket troopers. He blasts through several of them, but one does get a hold of him. Wrestling the imp, Rex whips the turret around to fire at close range if needed. But the partisan does get the upper hand, and the old vets share a nod. Nearly 2 decades of fighting. It might be hard to keep up with the younger troops, but at least they had their experience. The turret would help push the last of them back. With Ezra sending back the detonators, and the Mando Sabine rocketing up, they do take out the entire force. As the imps close off the entrance, Hera is trying to understand why Click-Clack is so confident that they should keep going deeper down. Once they hit what seems to be the bottom, Saw rushes out and shines a light on a series of large circular canisters. He recognizes them as gas canisters. The imps must have placed these here to fumigate their entire colony.
There. Just like his drawing. The circle in the circle. Now we know what happened to his people.
On seeing proof that the Geonosians suffered a worse fate than any people Saw had heard about, he concedes.
Those canisters are all we need to prove that the Empire wiped out its people. Everyone loses family in war. Even the enemy. The Geonosians deserve the same chance to rebuild that we do.
But the ground rumbles with the eruption of turbolaser fire raining down on them. Magnetic clamps grab the evidence as an avalanche of rocks race towards them. The cannons blast most to manageable bits, but some are avoided with the kind of piloting Saw had heard stories about. Excellent commanding had Sabine fire their proton torpedoes at the perfect time to take advantage of this unexpected reversal. They do escape, but this maneuver broke the gas canister free. Their only chance at definitive evidence that the Empire would not be able to lie their way out of.
To recover were images of the poison canisters.
The Empire would just claim these images were fake, but many individuals and leaders of star systems might be persuaded by them. And by Jun Sato's statements, he must have been not as critical of Saw as most rebel leadership.
The rescue of Saw Gerrera makes the mission a profound success.
While Saw's words with Canon show how worried he was that the Alliance was not taking the superweapon threat seriously.
We still don't know what the Empire was building on Geonosis.
We'll deal with it.
I just hope it won't be too late.
And after Saw had retired for some hard-earned rest, we see Hera pointing out to Ezra that Saw was not as cutthroat as he'd like to claim.
I've also got my issues with Saw, Ezra, but in the end, he proved he's not the Empire.
It was around this time that document NI-3814 from Mon Mothma's personal Rebel Alliance intelligence updates shows that they were heeding a warning from Saw about a massive secret project, but could not confirm any of his accusations. They were uncertain that these secret movings of material pointed to a single grand project, and were even more unsure of Jyn Erso working on it. Whoever wrote this pushes that this is not a conspiracy. However, though, it does note that General Jan Dodonna recommended that the Alliance cut all ties with Saw. 1 year later, in one BBY, his Phoenix Squad's friends were on their way to Yavin 4. Hera had told them that their cell was now merging under the rebel leadership here. Like how so many ragtag individual resistance groups from all sorts of worlds ended up wanting to take leadership from Saw Gerrera and went by the unified name Partisans, Mon Mothma, Bail Organa, and Fulcrum, aka Ahsoka Tano, had been working all these years to slowly connect rebel cells. The official declaration of the Rebel Alliance was only made months earlier. All this time back to 19 BBY with the end of the Clone Wars, they were just individual cells, at most vaguely aware of each other through contacts and intel drops. Now in this obscure Outer Rim world of Yavin 4, in ancient Massassi temples, the rebels finally had a central HQ. But the latest raid was foiled, and the leadership had their struggle with the fact that the Partisans had predicted this would happen, due to their intel on a new relay station.
How does Saw's ragtag group have better intel than we do?
Because Gerrera has absolutely no qualms about how he acquires it.
Everyone in this room had varying levels of support for Saw and the partisan methods, and since the threat was proven true, they planned to launch an attack on this new relay. Ezra is devastated that this mission took up priority over the mission to free his homeworld. Mon Mothma tries to explain to the young man that the complexity of this rebel alliance, how they choose who to save, and their recent defeats at the hand of Thrawn proved to her that their alliance was not ready for open war. He echoes things that Saw was ranting about to him, that they are already in open war, and these layers of conflicting interests and hierarchies of command were what Saw was warning against since the beginning. Ezra saw how it slowed everything down, and if Saw was like the Empire in terms of cruelty, Mon Mothma was like the Emperor in how everything was coldly assessed from a strategy table. Even with his Jedi Master, he voices these concerns.
Whether or not we fight,
It's how we choose to fight that matters, I know, Canon. Maybe we're choosing the wrong way.
They are interrupted by an enormous hollow projection from one of the astromechs.
Your losses today stemmed from your leader's cowardice, their unwillingness to take decisive action against the Empire.
Taking direct shots at Mon Mothma and laughing at their out-of-touch method of war. To Mothma's credit, she doesn't shut it down and engages him, saying the Senate was still working for peace, and when she calls him a criminal, Saw laughs off the acts she believed were serious war crimes, acts of terror, and when he says the Empire saw them both as criminals, he finally breaks through the Senator's stoic armor.
There she is! That's the leader the rebellion needs! Where is that fire, that passion, when your people need it most?
And he ends by mocking their silly idealism.
That you've lost, and the Empire reigns over the galaxy, unopposed. You will find some comfort in the knowledge that you fought according to the rules.
The Ghost was already tasked to attack the relay, and in the briefing, Ezra pushes back on Hera and the plan to just disrupt the relay. She knew he was right that it had to be destroyed, but Kanan warns that this was just all a reaction to Saw's stunt.
Hurt them the way they keep hurting us. Go straight at them and blow that relay right off the map.
That's Gerrera talking.
Mothma believed it was better to just disrupt it so that they could bypass it, as outright destroying it would just result in the Imps building another one, and potentially a greater lockdown on the area. The mission quickly went off the rails. Imperial Arquitans and a squad of TIE defenders were pushing the Ghost to its limits when Saw came to the rescue.
Sir, another ship just came out of hyperspace. It's moving to attack position.
With some fancy piloting, the U-Wing was able to hover right above the relay dish.
You rebels need a ride?
And by dropping down bundles of charges, he is able to rescue the Alliance team and pull off just as the entire station goes up in a dazzling display that took the cruiser with it.
Now that's how you deal with the Empire.
When they made it to atmosphere, a Star Destroyer and TIE fighters tried to capture them, giving Saw a perfect excuse to hold on to his favorite rebels. Hera demands he stop and let them return to the Ghost, but he uses the TIEs as a semi-excuse to jump to hyperspace. Once they are safely away, Saw admits he wanted their help for the mission his entire life seemed to be building up to.
The words you're looking for are, thank you.
And he made sure to play on their gratitude and frustration with Rebel Command.
Your choice. You can go back to Rebel Command and run Mon Mothma's errands, or you can help me do something that might actually matter.
Two Tubes laughs as they confirm that this raid will be going down, and moments later, they pop out of the blue void and make their approach to a civilian spaceport. As they sneak on the ship, they see stormtroopers and Imperial logs, as well as lists that one hangar was restricted. Saw knows that is exactly where they needed to go, and by silently taking out some imps, they find a container full of prisoners. Ezra is taken aback at how Saw didn't care at all that they freed these people. He was frustrated that this had nothing to do with the top secret materials he was tracking.
Your intel came through. We can free these people.
My intel wasn't about prisoners.
But I did overhear some troopers talking about the Jeddah system.
They keep looking for the hidden cargo, and only find it through Ezra's connection to some sound, like a mysterious song that was coming from behind an average-looking door. When Sabine slices in, they are greeted by death troopers and Saw instantly blasts them in the face. Working his way through some of the most elite fighters in the Empire, the descendants of those that carried out the vicious attack on Onderon 18 years earlier. When the container is compromised in the firefight, it's revealed to have a massive kyber crystal. The connection to Jyn Erso's necklace, her claims that Galen worked on these, the worlds that were stripped of these odd Jedi crystals, it all proved to him that he was right, that the secret project involved using immense energy storing capabilities of these kybers in order to create a super weapon.
These crystals store and amplify energy, so one this big is probably unstable. Put your blasters away.
But their presence was discovered, and Imperial reinforcements were on the way.
Alert Director Krennic at Imperial Command.
Saw Gerrera.
He wants to let this craft get to its destination in order to find the superweapon, but plays along when Sabine recommends setting the hyperdrive to override, only to take them both out when they least suspect it.
No!
I've come too far to give up the quest. I must learn the secrets of my enemy. And today, I will.
When they come to, they are furious with him, but he explains just how dire this situation is.
Geonosis was only the beginning. The materials, the power technician, the crystal, it all adds up to what the Empire's building. We have to ride this ship to the end, to those empty coordinates in the Tano sector. I know that's where we'll find this super weapon.
Moments later, they emerge at Tona Sector, an empty area of space according to all star charts, and instead of finding any prototype, it is just your typical Star Destroyer. Sabine tried to rub it in, but though shaken and confused, Saw is still certain that this is a major part of Jyn Erso's superweapon. But for now, it was clear that the only route was to sabotage the ship and escape.
Leave the prisoners?
It's too late for me. My world is gone. I lost everything. And once you do, you can see things clearly.
With a blow to the crystal, it becomes unstable and bolts of energy chaotically explode throughout the room. The rebels would be able to evacuate the prisoners and get past the destroyer just as the chain reaction consumed both the civilian transport and the capital ship. Saw was long gone by the time the ghost showed up, and all those prisoners now wanted to join up with the rebellion. Though Ezra was disenchanted with Saw's style, everyone was troubled by the truth in what he said.
What if Saw's right? And the Empire is already on the verge of winning a war most of the Rebel Alliance doesn't believe has already begun.
After this, the Partisans would destroy an Imperial metal factory on Duma 4, and over the next several months, leading to what would become Year Zero. Saw had suffered a series of injuries on raids that forced him to rely on a cybernetic leg and complicated armored breathing system. But these raids did serve their purpose. He finally had intel that said the massive kyber crystal he discovered originated from Jeddah, the ancient religious holy site with so many Force traditions and countless kybers. Once his scouts reported that the Imperial presence here had become so overt that they were destroying ancient cities to try and feed the kyber supply to their superweapon, Saw decided that he needed to move the Partisan HQ to Jeddah in order to keep a closer eye on these developments. The most holy city was Jeddah, and thus was the locus of Imperial presence, to the point that local resistance movements were rising up on their own. Saw set up base in the abandoned catacombs of Cadera, just a half-day's walk to the Holy City. The catacombs connected to massive caverns that could act like a hangar for a squadron that included at least 6 T-65 X-Wings and a pair of UT-60D U-Wings. Dubbed the Cavern Angels, these ships would emerge to conduct hit-and-run raids on kyber mines, with the imps assuming these hyperdrive-enabled long-range fighters must have popped out of hyperspace. Saw and the Partisans would secretly work their way into the local resistance groups that were popping up, one of them being headed by Guardian of the Wills Chirrut Imwe and Baze Malbus. To win them over, Saw gave the Guardians the funds and provisions needed to keep their friend's orphanage running. But in these next months, the imps were catching on that there was a problem with the locals, dropping their Star Destroyer out of orbit and sitting right above the Holy City. Patrols and violence increased, marking just the latest example of this death spiral of a city, as oppression led to more rebels, leading to more oppression. This prompted the Guardians to plead to Gerrera for help in stealing a Sentinel-class shuttle so that they could evacuate the orphans and pass through the imp checkpoints. Beezer Fortuna, cousin of the Cretan Bib Fortuna, would lead this strike and secure the craft. But then Gerrera contacted him to use the shuttle as an explosive to take out the ISD, which was still hovering over the city. Luckily for the kids, the Force was with Imwe, as he was able to talk some sense into Saw and allow the evacuation to go ahead. This incident also worked to cut all ties with the local fighters and Partisans, who were willing to destroy the Holy City. In the months that led up to the climactic Battle of Scarif, the Partisans took custody of Bodhi Rook. Rook, once a loyalist pilot for the Empire, had chosen to defect. His possession of vital information from Jyn Erso about the Death Star, which was nearing completion, made him the final missing piece in Saw's puzzle. However, Saw had been scarred and full of mistrust over these many years, and perceived Rook's arrival as a potential Imperial ruse. To verify Rook's claims, Gerrera subjected him to an invasive procedure using the creature Boar Gullet, which could extract truths, but often left its subjects mentally disturbed. With Rook now in a state of shock and incapacitation, Gerrera shifted his focus to intercepting an Imperial Kyber crystal transport in Jedha City. The ambush ensnared not just Imperial forces, but also Rebel agent Captain Cassian Andor and Jyn Erso, who were on a mission to secure Rook and the crucial message he carried. Brought before Gerrera in the ancient catacombs of Cadera, Jyn faced an interrogation by the very man who once protected her.
Jyn! Is it really you? I can't believe it.
The reunion was filled with tension, as Jyn, who felt abandoned by Gerrera in her youth, questioned just how far he had fallen, and Gerrera himself challenged her commitment to the Rebellion's cause. Their exchange was interrupted when he revealed the holo message from her father, in which he exposed the Death Star's vulnerability.
I've placed a weakness deep within the system, a flaw so small and powerful they will never find it. I lied. I learned to lie. I played the part of a beaten man resigned to the sanctuary of his work. I made myself indispensable, and all the while, I laid the groundwork for my revenge.
But this reunion, and revelation and validation of Jyn's claim that her father was a good man, this moment was cut short by the Empire, who, sensing an opportunity to quell the growing insurgency and validate the capabilities of their superweapon, sanctioned a test firing of the Death Star on Jedha. The resulting cataclysm obliterated Jedha City and sent a lethal shockwave surging through the land. Faced with imminent destruction, Gerrera chose to free his captives, urging Jyn to use her father's information to complete this mission which had consumed him for nearly 2 decades, hoping that the rebellion would finally be bold enough to pull this off. While a wave of destruction was racing toward him, the elusive nightmare weapon making itself known in the rippling crust. Ironically, the Death Star would finally give Saw peace, a peace that he had not felt since his sister died. And the last words on his lips were her name, calling to Steela as he stood on the threshold of the afterlife. While his eyes saw the wall of death, his mind was reliving his most cherished memories. Post the climactic Battle of Yavin, remnants of Gerrera's partisans converged, forming a new faction dubbed the Dreamers, under the leadership of Staven and Lux Bonteri. The formidable Imperial faction Inferno Squad made it their mission to dismantle the Dreamers, succeeding by infiltrating their stronghold on Geosin and triggering its implosion from within. Another splinter faction, headed by Benthic, staunchly held their ground on Jedha, countering Imperial advances as they sought the moon's rich Kyber crystal reserves. Years later, in the era of the New Republic, the legacy of Saw Gerrera and his partisans remained divisive. Some, like the ambitious centrist Senator Ransom Costurfo, labeled Gerrera and his faction as radical terrorists, representing the darker shades of the Rebel Alliance. And that concludes the complete life of Saw Gerrera. Please hit that like button, it's the best way to help me out. Subscribe to see more, and check out these videos, I'm sure you'll like them. But most important of all, remember, the best way to win any war is to convince your enemy it hasn't begun. And the Force will be with you, always.